Let's go ahead and just dive in. We're going to talk about Christian Science. We're going to talk about what this practice of Christianity, this approach to Christianity, does to help us feel God, experience God, not just kind of talk about God or read about God, but understand God in essence. We'll talk about what all that has to do with healing in our lives, how we connect the dots between big ideas about God and experiencing God and finding actual relief from the things that we face, not just personally in our own lives or bodies, but in society. And I think that's a lot about what the folks in Wilmington have been praying about. Just how to uplift and actually make a difference from a spiritual standpoint when it comes to what feel like intractable trends in society, what feel like divisions and societal influences that just feel, sometimes insurmountable. So I want to start out by telling you two stories. And as we go along, you'll notice I do my best to unpack big words, big concepts as we talk about them. Words like God and spirituality and healing. Try not to just throw those out without talking about them more and explaining what they are. But when I tell you these stories, I'll just tell them to you how I experience them. And then after that, we're going to do a lot of the unpacking and dot connecting and so on. And we'll tell some more stories as we go too. So the first story was from a number of years ago. I was attending a big conference. It was a week-long conference. There were thousands of people there, and it had all gone really pretty well until the very last session with the main sponsors or organizers of the event. And it was an open Q&A period, and somebody asked a question that turned out to be controversial. It was not a topic I was passionate about, so I didn't feel that way, but one of the organizers did their best to answer the question, and it seemed to just inflame things. After that, the second organizer took a stab at it, and then the third and the fourth. There were 5 of them, and each time it just seemed to get worse. Each time things seemed to balloon up. The reactions seemed to be heavier and more intense to what was being said, and that reaction wasn't just coming from a few. At first it was, but the intensity of that reaction started to spread throughout this crowd. An anger, a frustration, a feeling of, hey, maybe you're not answering the question in a straightforward way. Maybe you're trying to dodge it or hide something and so on. It's like, looking back on it, it felt a little like being at a sports event when people go around and do the wave, except it was like this emotional intensity that just, I would say, almost everybody in the audience started to get caught up in. You've heard the phrase mob mentality, and I think that's the closest I've ever been to a really intense mob mentality. And you know what? I got caught up in it too. I remember feeling that same intensity. I remember feeling the same anger and frustration until the 5th organizer stood up. Now, this woman, as it turns out, I met her later and talked to her, and she's a Christian Scientist. She's somebody who was approaching the way she was thinking in that moment from the standpoint of the kind of things we're talking about tonight. And what she started to talk about was just love. She didn't speak directly to the issue per se from like a logistical or informational standpoint, but it was very purposeful what she was doing. And it wasn't so much what she said, because I actually don't remember what she said. I just remember it was about love. But what I really remember was what I felt. It wasn't the words about love, it was the feeling of love. It was really clear. This woman was loving the audience, was loving every side of it. I don't know that she even saw two sides. I think she just saw this group of people that had come for a unified purpose. All in their hearts wanted good, and she was just loving on them. She was loving on all of us, and on our purpose for being there. And it was kind of like things had ballooned up, and somebody just took a pin and not popped it in like a violent way, but just like quickly let all the air out of it. This whole intensity just deflated very rapidly, and then it was gone. It was like out of the room. And it wasn't until it was gone that I realized what had happened. When I was caught up in it, I didn't realize I was caught up in it. It just felt like, yeah, this is my thinking and I'm so angry. But when it was gone, I remember thinking, wow, how did that happen? That's when I realized, gosh, that's what it's like to get caught up in a mob mentality. And it actually, I remember thinking to myself, it's like hypnotism. It felt like I had just kind of been hypnotized and was waking up and realizing, wow, gosh, that was intense. But what just felt so much more real, so much more me, so much more natural was this love that was filling the room. And the meeting went on. There was no more discussion about it. It didn't, I think, feel like there needed to be at that point. There was a good tone. I think people felt overall satisfied. Maybe there were still elements of this question to work out. But I think everyone felt a solid basis to work it out going forward. And the meeting wrapped up well. Well, that's the end of that short story. And like I said, we'll come back to it. I want to draw some themes out and compare it to some of the things we're talking about. But I'll just push pause and I'm going to tell you the second story. The second story was from a number of years ago too. It was from a young woman who called me. She was 16 years old. She was in high school. And she'd been having trouble with her eyesight. She used to sit in the back of the room, I think, with the cool kids, but she couldn't see the board anymore in school. So she moved up closer and closer until she was sitting in the front row and still, could see, but had to strain a little bit to do it. And she not wanted to get glasses, but then it was time to get her driver's license, and she knew she was going to have to do something about this. She was open to going and getting glasses, I think, at that point, but she decided that she wanted to pray about it first. So again, we're going to talk about prayer and what it means and all that in a moment, but she called me, and she called me because of my role as a Christian Science practitioner that I mentioned in the intro. And that's just somebody who's available to talk with anyone who calls, who's looking for healing insights, through prayer, through prayerful perspectives. So as we talked on the phone a little bit, and she told me where she was coming from, what she was dealing with, one really interesting idea came to mind, and it was not something that I expected. I don't think she expected it. But the thought that came was, you know what? Let's not you, the person who called me, pray for yourself at all right now. Do nothing but just pray for. I prayed for her too, and we'll dive in more. But what happened was, after a week, she decided she was going to go do the first part of her driver's license. Not the driving part, but the first part, the exam where you do the written test. And then it's also the day when you take your eye exam. So she called me and we talked about just, let's keep your deal. Let's just work to see everybody from a more godlike standpoint, and then call me afterward. And so apparently when she called me afterwards, she said she did the written test and that was fine. She passed that part. She went and she got in line. And the way it was in California at that time anyway, you line up, there's an eye chart, and for everybody else who's there that day, you kind of wait and you take your turn. And she said she did her best while she was waiting in the line to not think about herself or worry about herself, but to get more insightful, spiritual, uplifted views of everybody else in the line in front of her and all around her. And then she said when she got to the front of the line, she looked at the eye chart and she said she could see it perfectly. She called me that day really excited, saying, I'm looking at everything and it's normal, it's perfect. She never ended up needing to get glasses. She did go forward after high school and then college. This is, like I said, a number of years ago. She got a job in a government organization where she needed to be taking regular physicals, including eye exams and things. And She doesn't call me anymore. She's in her, mid late 20s, I think, at this point. But she used to call me the first couple of times she took one and said 2020 vision. It's, just moving forward. So, okay, that's sort of the end of that story for right now. We'll push pause there too. But, it's a launching point. It's a launching point in, I hope, both of those stories for us to say, well, gosh, what happened? How does that work? How do you make sense of all that? And then, of course, what does it have to do with the kind of things that we're thinking about in our daily lives? So I want to just start with a word, and this word is integral to both of those stories, and that's prayer. I want to talk about what that is and what that means. We'll go from there. In the Bible, Jesus is asked, according to one of the accounts, by some of his students, how do you pray? And Jesus' first response is to say, go into your closet. In the context of that, he says things like, don't let prayer be this thing that you do in front of other people. Don't let it be this thing that is about how it looks to others, the surface appearances. And I think by extension, it's also kind of like, not just step away from the surface appearances and other people's opinions, but what I get out of it too is maybe step away from your own, surface level assessments of things and step away from your own knee-jerk reaction to things. We've all had those. After Jesus says, go into your closet, he gives what many Christians today call the Lord's Prayer. And the Lord's Prayer, in essence, we won't dissect the whole thing, but it talks a little bit about God's nature, and it talks a little bit about our relationship to God and about what that means in our lives, what we can expect. So, in a really broad sense, when Jesus is asked, how do you pray? He says, take a step back from the surface appearances, the knee-jerk reactions, the opinions, the preconceived notions. Get focused on the nature of God and on our relationship with God. So as we talk about how this spiritual perspective relates to the experiences I mentioned before and the stuff we're thinking about today, let's just carry that forward. I think we all get the need to step back sometimes, but let's look at the last two parts. Jesus said, in essence, get focused on the nature of God and on our relationship with God. Well, okay, if we're going to do that, let's talk about what God is. God is literally an infinite subject, so there are many ways to think about God. But one way that Jesus talked about God is as spirit. Now, spirit is a word that can sound pretty otherworldly, pretty abstract, and certainly not connecting to our daily lives, I think, a lot of times. But that's the way we think of the word in English, and I think that Jesus didn't speak in English, and the word that's in the Bible, in the New Testament, which is written in Greek, actually, as well as the same word that's translated in English as spirit in the Hebrew Scriptures, what Christians call the Old Testament, that word spirit in both those languages is actually the exact same word for wind or breath. And so for me, in one instance, when Jesus is talking about God being spirit, he says, well, you don't see where the wind is coming from and you don't see where it's going, but you see the leaves moving in the trees. And so I get this feeling like instead of talking about God as this abstract, faraway, otherworldly, ethereal kind of a thing, talking about God as spirit probably made God feel very close, very relevant, like the very air around us. Not something you see, but something that you feel, something that you see the effect of, like when the wind moves the leaves in the trees. Something that's like our very breath itself, integral to life, maybe not something we're thinking about, but you'd know it real fast if you didn't have it. And in fact, elsewhere in the Bible, it says that God is life. So to me, that jives. It says also that God is truth and that God is love. And so that all jives too, because, well, love is not a thing that we see, but we see the effects of love. We see love expressed in acts of kindness and generosity. We see truth expressed in acts of honesty and integrity. So the Bible has this really rich way of talking about God that really gets beyond like a tribal leader up in the clouds to an ever-presence. An ever-presence that is life itself, that is the creator of all. The Bible says everything that was made by God, and nothing was made that God didn't make. And that what God made is entirely good. And also that the same fountain doesn't send forth both fresh water and salty water. So there's this feeling that God is like life and truth and love and the source of all intelligence and wisdom, the kind of principle of the universe, the cause, the power, and the maker of all, and all that God made being pure good without something that can be unlike it. The same fountain doesn't send forth fresh water and salty water to me means, a God that is life itself doesn't send forth destruction, doesn't even allow for it, doesn't somehow use it for some greater good in the long run any more than light uses darkness to somehow achieve its means in the long run. Love doesn't use hate. Truth doesn't use mistakes, errors, and so on. So what God makes is pure good, like God. Okay, let's just talk about the last part of this, and then we'll connect everything. What's our relationship to the God like that? Remember, prayers take that step back from the surface appearances, get focused on the nature of God and on our relationship to God. Well, okay, so what is our relationship to this God that is like the God we're talking about? The very first thing the Bible says about anybody is that we're made in the likeness of God. And that's not a one-off statement. It shows up again and again. In the Hebrew Scriptures, in Isaiah, it says, "Call my sons from far, my daughters from the ends of the earth." Everyone who's, formed and made by God, for God's purpose. And later, Jesus talks about being perfect as God is perfect. And St. Paul, after him, comes and says, put off the old man, the old sense of yourself, and put on the new man, the new sense of yourself, which is created to be like God. So the idea that what God is reflected in us or expressed through us, that we come from God and therefore we have built into our nature God-like qualities, is a theme actually that runs through the Bible. It comes up again and again. What does that mean if God is life and God is love and God is truth? It means that built into us are, again, God-like qualities: freedom, clear thinking, safety, strength, love, vitality, wholeness and balance, peacefulness, the opportunity for good, the ability to do good and be part of good, being filled up. God is not partially good, but God is wholly good. So that means we are made completely filled to the brim with nothing but God, God likeness, God's goodness. So, okay, that's an interesting thought, and it seems to be rooted in the Bible, but here's where we need to connect some dots, because it doesn't look like that. That's not what we get, on the news alerts on our phone or when we turn on the radio or whatever else. So how do we take this idea of a God being ever-present and pure good and us being made in God's likeness and connect that to what we see? And that's where our theme of spiritual discovery comes in. Because I think it's common and easy, even somewhat logical, to look at that and say, well, I don't see how it connects, and therefore, maybe that's just what you believe. And a lot of people today, I think they look at spirituality in religion and so forth as, if they're being favorable, it's like, hey, that's your faith tradition. That's great. That's it's positive thinking. It's something that makes you feel good. But it's not reality. And then, or the other side, if they're being less favorable, is like, lots of people think, to be even thinking along those lines is so unrealistic that it's like you're burying your head in the sand and just not dealing with reality. And so that's a key thing I really want to address, because there's really not a lot of point, other than maybe it makes you feel good, if that's as far as spirituality really goes. But what Christian Science does for me, what it shows people, again, the very first thing we said really is to get beyond just talking about God and actually experiencing God. In order to experience something or prove something, there has to be reality in it. It's not just positive thinking. So the word discovery is helps bridge that for me. Discovery, in many senses, what has progressed humanity throughout human history. There have been many discoveries. Discoveries, though, they often fly in the face of the way things have been perceived before, or done before, or believed before. It causes a kind of revolution in thinking that is unexpected. And but then, if it is a discovery, it means it's actually there. It's rooted in something. And then once people discover it, they can build on it. They can actually, there's a tangible result. There's something provable that comes from it. Scientific discoveries, we all love those. We just, like a month ago, sent a rocket out to collect samples from an asteroid and then bring that back, land on Earth, so that we could, dissect and kind of look through and understand the elements of what's there. That's incredible. Nobody thought positively about that. And that's rooted in something that nobody would have even conceived of 100 years ago. And yet there were actual kind of mathematical ideas that could be understood, that could be built on, and then built on again until that's something that was achievable. Nobody looked up at the sky and saw asteroids and thought, from a visible standpoint, this is doable. Nobody just thought positively, like put a bunch of rocket fuel in an engine and launched it and figured that'll take care of it. I have a really positive attitude about it. It's so much more. And so, the understanding, the math was always there. That's a discovery. It was already there to be understood. And the more it was understood, the more we could build something with it. Well, let's get beyond, the scientific ones are kind of fun, but let's think about what's really changed the world in so many ways. I would say anything that is a breakthrough in humanity's understanding of itself and of what's normal and natural from a political standpoint or a social standpoint or anything else, to the degree that it's rooted in something normal and real and always possible, but that shifts the way we do things for the better, I would call that a discovery. And I would say the reason to look at it this way is because, again, we're not just burying our head in the sands if a wholly different view that looks so different than the way things appear to be actually makes change for the better. Here's my example. 100 and some odd years ago, you may or may not know that women were looked at as literally lesser physiological beings, meaning like we're all born the same, but if you stop growing at a certain point, you're called a woman, and if you grow to completion, you're called a man. That was the general perspective of a lot of people, from what I understand, and including intelligent people, educated people, kind-hearted people, people who wanted good in the world, and it was never true, but it was believed. And because it was believed, we acted on that belief. We created our laws around that kind of belief. We treated people, half of society, a certain way. And it's not like we're totally done with this one yet, but I think we could say that instead of it ignoring the problem to say, no, that's a lie. Let's look in a different direction for what is true, and let's start building on another point of view. Not only did it not ignore the problem, it was literally the only way forward. People who started to wrestle with the concept of wait a second, maybe equality is already here. Maybe these people are actually already equal. That's a discovery. It's already there. But wrestling with that till there's a mental shift, and then we start rewriting our laws to act on what we've discovered mentally. That follows that same kind of pattern. And it's not ignoring the problem. The other way to look at it is, if you accepted the lie and then tried to fix it without kind of denying it, how far would you get? Let's say you have one of these really kind-hearted people, and they say, I want to make the other half of society equal, but they believe that half of society is literally a physiologically less developed human being. How are you going to fix that? If you believe that and you operate on that premise, then I think maybe you start trying to create a pill or something to like get the other half of people's bodies, society's bodies, to start growing again. I mean, it's kind of crazy. You wouldn't get anywhere. You couldn't bring about equality if you started with the lie. So the idea of challenging the premise is essential to progress. And I think that's what spirituality does. Genuine spirituality, what we see in the Bible, is people in the midst of war and famine and outcasts from society and considered incurable, who they take a step back in the face of the things they're dealing with. And they get focused on the nature of God, whatever their highest concept of God is at the time. And then they get results. They find food in a famine. They find water in a drought. They find community again when they've been outcast. They find wholeness and health again when they've been considered untouchable or incurable. So you do see this cause and effect relationship, this pattern that goes along with kind of how Jesus talked about, take that step back, get focused on what's real and on what that means for you, and then operate on that level, and how that fits, I think, the same pattern of discovery on any level, and how that certainly isn't positive thinking, and it certainly isn't ignoring things. It's like with the toughest stuff that we face, it seems to be like that's actually the only way forward. When people have looked at how to govern, under an autocracy or something for hundreds of years, thousands of years, a certain way, and then people start to get the idea, wait a second, maybe we could have a democracy, maybe we could all vote. That's a shift in thought that moves that whole society forward. So an idea, when rooted in truth, is powerful. And it's not just a little self-help system, it's what moves the world forward. Jesus talked about the nature of really of all suffering and all evils of the world as fundamentally a lie. Bible uses other words like deception, temptation, accusation, but none of those really sound like something that's true. They sound like a distorted sense of what's true and the suffering that comes from it. If we believe a lie, it causes suffering the same way, we talked about with the way women were viewed. And that's true about anything. You operate on the lie and you get bad results, bad data, bad results. So what happens when we start to look at that which is unlike God's nature as unnatural? If what God made is what is fundamental, what is normal, what is natural, what is pure good in every single one of us, then I would say healing is those breakthrough moments, whether on a societal level or an individual level, where we begin to reason out from a different standpoint. We're uplifted by those views. We're comforted by those views. And those views, because they're rooted in something actual, not just a positive thought, they give us a kind of substantial foundation on which to build and which to experience more of the results that are in line with the truer premise. Going back to those first stories, let's kind of apply what we're talking about. That young woman who called me, it's not a miracle when there's a shift in our lives. People talk about healing sometimes like a miracle. But it's, again, kind of a discovering what's normal and natural. If we are all built, and if she was built to be whole, to see rightly, to have clarity in her thinking, in her understanding, in her love for her neighbor, and her understanding of herself and her freedom, her right to, be complete already without needing anything else. I would say that's on some small level that day what dawned on her, and maybe not just that day, but over that week as she was praying. Prayer being that step back from how things seem to be and really engaging with a bigger sense of God and God's love for everybody. And the thing is, it sounds miraculous because we look at our lives as pretty compartmentalized. And so even if we believe that a spiritual point of view can make a difference, like in our relationships or our workplaces or something, because it affects our attitude, we tend to think of our bodies as something different and as other parts of our lives as something different. But if there's just one source, if there's just one cause, then our lives are not so compartmentalized. The qualities and characteristics of our health come from that same source. The qualities and characteristics of our relationships and of our sense of purpose and career and all of it, it all kind of is wrapped up in the same root. And so to get a better sense of those qualities that we need and deserve as coming from God, give us the capacity to build on that premise in any area of our life, to see more God-likeness, more wholeness, more freedom shining through. I want to apply this to the first story we talked about, but I also want to pause for just a second and say, I know there was a little mix-up with a few folks about what time the talk was going to start tonight. So if for any reason you're tuning in around now, around 7:30, just know that I think you can rewind and start from the beginning right now. If not, then there'll be a replay just a few minutes, 10, 15 minutes or so after we wrap up here tonight. So we're talking about applying everything we've discussed to these first stories, and then we're going to carry it forward and talk about the stuff we're thinking about in the news and the stuff the Wilmington folks have been praying about in the community. But first, that other story, why did I share that? Well, one of the things that the folks in Wilmington told me they're praying about is, what feels like the elements, whether they're in social media or in other trends politically or anywhere else, that just the stuff that we all can see and feel many times, dividing us, that just sort of seem to sweep us or others up, maybe just often unintentionally, into views that feel polarized, feel angry, feel unable to see a way forward. It's less about who's right and who's wrong and more about the way that seems to just hold hostage progress and create, and cause us to feel a lot of things that don't feel so good and godlike and loving. What does it mean to be able to step back from that and think for ourselves? What does it mean to be able to reason out from a standpoint that brings about more love and more progress? That's kind of what that first story was about. What that woman brought to that room that day wasn't just a positive thought for herself. It wasn't just, she certainly didn't push a religious view on anybody, but what she brought to the room, not just through her words, but I think through how she saw things, through the love that exuded from that perspective that she was discovering about God's presence and about God's all embrace and about every single one of us as being part of that. It's like the light, if somebody opens the windows in a room and it's dark inside, but the light comes in, everybody in the room gets the light. The power is not in the person who opened the blinds. The power is in the light. The woman didn't have some kind of magic. she just let in the light. But the light is powerful. The light of what is true, the light of what is rooted in the nature of God, which is love, in an understanding that is calm, that is clear thinking, that is constructive, that allows us to build and move forward in a unified way. I mean, that's all the kind of stuff that flows from good, from God. And I think that's what she brought to it. She was, in Bible language, bearing witness to the presence of that already there. And then she was reasoning out from and acting on that standpoint. And it made a big difference. It made a big difference for a whole lot of people. And I would argue, if it hadn't happened, if there hadn't been kind of healing that day, if the mob mentality had not been broken, those few thousand people would have gone out, and it would have rippled out, and it would have caused even more turmoil. But instead, it was ended, and not just ended and everybody buried their head in the sand and swept things under the carpet, but ended in a way that allowed people to think constructively and move things forward. And I do know that there was some resolution to some of that stuff down the road. So tonight, that's what we're talking about. When we talk about spiritual discovery, when we talk about prayer and how it relates, I have a quote from the Bible I want to read you, and one other quote, and then we'll go from there. This is from St. Paul, and I think to me it kind of reinforces what we're talking about. In 1 Corinthians in the Bible, it says, "Now we see things imperfectly, like puzzling reflections in a mirror, but then we will see everything with perfect clarity. All that I know now is partial and incomplete, but then I will know everything completely, just as God now knows me completely." That idea that it's already there, we just don't see it fully, we don't see it clearly. And so we're not trying to change reality. We're trying to step back from the distortions, the kind of the lies, the misperceptions that we're educated into thinking, or just the mentalities that any of us get caught up in times. Knee-jerk reactions, fears, or just judging by the surface appearance of things. You know, if you judged 3 plus 6 based on a surface appearance alone, you'd think to yourself, okay, 3 and 6 together, the plus sign means you put them together, that means I've got a 3 and a 6, I've got a 36. And again, like we said, when we reason out from something that is rooted in a misperception or a lie, bad data, we get bad results. You try and do your grocery shopping or balance your bank account with that kind of math, and it will cause suffering. And so we tend to treat ourselves in the world like that. We've all seen stuff. We've all been through difficult times, suffering. Nobody's denying it. But the question is, how do we deal with it? When it looks like, hey, my parents were like that, and therefore this is what I'm like. Or I was in this kind of environment, and now I'm feeling like this. Use our example about women. Operating on a certain standpoint on that lie of inequality, people, were raised in a way that gave them less access to education and so forth. So if you look at the results of your lie and how it has affected society, you might say, oh yeah, sure, less intelligent people. But it's only the result of the lie. It's not because it's actually normal or natural. So to look beneath the surface appearance and say, I'm not denying that I see the bad effects of surface level reasoning, but we're not stuck there. Humanity is not stuck there, not on a health level, not on any level, because really the principle of everything is rooted in God's nature. We can begin to see that 3 plus 6 equals 9. We can do that kind of math. If you're only judging on the surface appearance, you might think it's a miracle. Where did a 9 come from? I saw a 6 and a 3. And a 9 just appeared out of nowhere? Well, that's because the whole premise of putting two numbers together was wrong. You have to kind of just fully wipe that out. And then what seems invisible, like a 9, it feels so natural as you go forward and you start to understand the principle behind it and you start to prove it. We're proving a principle, and like Jesus said about God as spirit, it might not seem visible, but neither is love, neither is truth, none of these things that are so integral to what we know we care about in life is a visible thing, but it is a thing that as you feel it, as you reason from it, if you reason from the standpoint of love, you get loving results. Reasoning from the standpoint of God's nature and what it means about us, we get more godlike results, even when it flies in the face of how things seem to be and how, what people have been experiencing to the contrary. It's not a miracle to me. That again, that's what the Bible is telling us is natural. I'm going to read you another line here. This is from Mary Baker Eddy's book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. Mary Baker Eddy is the founder of this movement, this approach to Christianity. I'll talk more about her in a little bit, but she's somebody who really struggled through stuff in her own life, but also found a lot of healing in her own life and helped a lot of other people find it too. Again, whoever opens the blinds lets in the light. The power is never in a particular person, but she felt that the more she discovered that light, the more she was able to share it with others who went forward and discovered it for themselves and then experienced it for themselves and then helped somebody else do the same and that kind of thing. So it's been kind of a grassroots healing movement from the inception. And this book is about Christian Science. It explains Christian Science and how the ideas in the Bible are livable, how we can experience the Bible's promise and healing here today. So here's what she wrote in this book. The conceptions of mortal erring thought must give way to the ideal of all that is perfect and eternal. Through many generations, human beliefs will be attaining diviner conceptions, and the immortal and perfect model of God's creation will finally be seen as the only true conception of being. She starts the next sentence with the word science. She's talking about the science of Christ, what we're talking about today. That is an approach to Christianity that's rooted in understanding, and from a sense that it's universal and provable and is understandable. Anyway, she says this science of Christ reveals the possibility of achieving all good and sets mortals at work to discover what God has already done. To me, that echoes kind of what Paul was saying. It's there. We will know better as God already knows us. We are discovering it, and as our models, as our conceptions are getting clearer, we're discovering what is there and proving it. You know, to me, the whole life of Jesus is about this. It's like Jesus proving good is real. Good has power. Good matters. Good is God. God with us. So good is with us. And good is experienceable. It's provable. I know it doesn't always look like that. It looks like the world's dealing with a lot of things, and it is. But the promise here is that we can step by step prove the power of good. You know, Jesus, he was called Christ. Christ was a title, not his last name. And it symbolized that presence and power and divinity of God that shone through his life so brilliantly. Talking about the light, letting the light in. That light of God shone through the life of Jesus so uniquely in human history. And it uplifted many people. It changed the world. That true idea of God, what God is and what our relationship with God is, just shone through him. He exemplified it. He shared it. He helped people literally experience it. That true idea of God reaching human experience, human consciousness. He showed us what real power is like. And in the Bible, later in the book of Revelation, it says, somebody says, I'm trying to open the book of life, metaphorically. And what they hear is look for a lion. And when they look, they find it says a lamb. And Jesus was called the Lamb of God because people were looking for this kind of leader, this Messiah or Savior, really in very human terms, very surface level terms. They were looking for a military leader, a political leader, and what they got was very different. It's a very different sense of power. Jesus showed us that qualities like meekness and hungering and thirsting after righteousness and mercifulness and so on are the qualities that would allow us to open the blinds and let the light in. The light of God, the truth of what is real and normal here and now, it's transforms human experience. But this feeling of personal control and ego and fear, I have to do this, I have to make it happen, I have to change people and things, that is really kind of the opposite of the qualities that Jesus showed help us let in the light. You know, the presence and activity of God is always with us. It doesn't come and go. It was here before Jesus. It was here uniquely in Jesus, but also, you know, it's here now. It's here for you and me. It's always here. We're never trapped. That light of God that uplifts and transforms is here. Whatever we face, the divisions in society, those kind of influences that we talked about, whether they're malicious or ignorant, things we just get swept up in, the hate, the war, the true idea of God, that light of God, as we're stepping back and we're going, but wait a second, God, what are you? And what does that mean? What does it mean about me? What does it mean about the person I think I don't like? What does it mean about these two people that seem to have been at war for generations? How does this transform my sense of who they are, how they think, what's normal for them, what's in their hearts? What is literally already there to be discovered? How does that, as I'm discovering more of the answers to those questions from a God-like perspective, that is a perspective rooted in God's nature, how does that then give me ideas, about things I can say, things I can do? How does it help lead to both intermediate and immediate solutions as well as long-term resolutions? Stuff in humanity doesn't always change overnight, but when you look at these things we were talking about, like with women, it's step by step by step by step action rooted in what is normal and what is true is unstoppable. It may seem to be resisted at times, but we can't change what's true. We can't change what's normal. You can't change that 3 and 6 equals 9, no matter how much you shout at it, no matter how much hate seems to surround it, no matter how much human drama and reasons for this side and that side seem to be there. 3 and 6 is 9. It just is. And it is for everybody, for every side. To me, this is what Jesus was showing us, the sort of 3 and 6 equals 9 of our being, of the nature of life rooted in and of God. Showing us that it is normal to be awake and aware of the influence of love, the influence of truth, that we and our neighbors are naturally love-filled, naturally intelligent, and not able to be manipulated and so forth. Naturally useful, that the solutions that are here, the path forward for everybody, brings mutual blessing for every side, whether you're talking on a local level, a national level, or a global level. Jesus showed us this kind of third option. It takes humility to seek something other than this side or that when it seems like, only one can be right. But the humility to seek that third way, that way that's in and of God, that it doesn't support extremes any more than it supports a wishy-washy middle ground that doesn't get anything done, but a practical, solid, step by step way that unifies, that lifts us above the kind of mob mentalities and hypnotic, ways of seeing things, and not just us, but again, like that first story, helps lift everybody. This is not just, again, a self-help thing. This is like the truth that we embrace for our neighbors. It does matter. Even if we never talk to somebody, even if our entire action is just quiet, spiritual. It's natural for it to lead to outward action, but there are many quiet prayers that matter, even when no outward action comes from it, because the light is dealing with the darkness. It's not my darkness and your darkness and their darkness. It's just a lie doesn't belong to anybody. And as you bring the light to bear on the darkness, it dispels the darkness. As you bring truth to bear on a lie, in any sense in consciousness, it helps to whittle away at and just obliterate, the lie and show what's true. I'm going to tell you a couple other quick stories, and then we'll pause for a moment and get into our question and answer period. First is a quick story from just about a couple months ago. A woman called me who worked for a global intergovernmental organization that you all know. And she was put on an assignment to help bring resolution to this group that had been working together for quite a long time and was at a total stalemate. There were representatives from different organizations and member states there, and they had completely divergent views and were at each other's throats. And it was important, though, that they found a way forward, because without some kind of consensus, a really important policy decision that would affect a lot of people would not be able to be made. And so she called me for prayer, to pray together. And one of the things that came out of our thinking and praying together and just listening for what ideas would help was, back off from feeling like you're responsible for this. This is not yours. The world is not in your hands. These people are not in your hands. It's not your job to change people. It's not even your job to get a policy change here, because I know that's what you've been assigned to do, but really your job is just to follow Christ. Your job is to show up, bear witness to what is true, bear witness to that presence and activity of what is good and godlike in every single person, each in their own individual and unique ways. It's not about trying to make other people like you or like what you think they should think, but it's the humility to actually step away from a preconceived notion about what they should do or what they should think, with the understanding that whatever it is, whatever they naturally do think, it's got to come from their direct relationship with God. It's got to come from something that is able to find unity and harmony with others step by step and go forward. So we talked about how to reason out from there. She had a big meeting coming up, and she was worried about what to do. And as we prayed together, she found a peace. And literally at the minute the meeting was supposed to start, it got canceled. And that seemed to be kind of a blessing, because it meant just more time to pray. And what happened was, over the course of the next month and a half, there was internal wrestling to do. There was lots of arguments, lots of information on the surface that said this wasn't possible. And so prayer is not just a happy thought you throw at it and walk away, but it's the constant moment by moment mental wrestling. Just like if you're going to build a rocket and send it up to an asteroid, you don't just get one good thought about building a rocket and you're done. You reason through every aspect of it. And so every aspect of this, every time it came to mind, every time there was a step to take, a conversation to have, there was, how do I step back and be more informed than ever by a godlike point of view? And the short of it is that over the next month and a half, some really interesting ideas came about how to have some one-on-one side conversations and some small group conversations among some key members. And the next time they met, there was a total transformation. More progress was made in that next meeting over that course of that month and a half than had been able to be made in over a year and a half. The stalemate was broken and new policy was created, and they moved forward. Again, it's like we all can do this wherever we are. We're living a principle. And sometimes you may be in a position somewhere in a school where you can help with policy change, or in government or whatever. But that's not so much the point. If we are living the principle of this in our personal relationships, in our neighborhood councils, and in anything else, we are proving something that is the 3 + 6 = 9 for all of humanity. And that matters. That's just one little example, but it proves it's normal, proves it's possible. One other short story, a woman called me one time. She was really distraught. Her mother-in-law was coming to visit, and she said her mother-in-law had hated her from before she was even married, hated her when she was dating this woman's son, hated her at the wedding and made it known in some ugly ways, hated her anytime she came to visit, and it was just horrible. She said everything she could do to try and make it better outwardly just never seemed to pacify the situation. So we talked about how to pray about it. And one of the things that came to mind that really goes along with everything else we've been saying tonight, when we talk about not changing people, the hardest part is when we look out and we seem to see a mentality that doesn't get it, a mentality that seems hateful, a mentality that seems hypnotized by whatever influences are there messing with it. We are convinced that's the person, But if Jesus identified the evils of the world, all of them, as fundamentally a lie about what is normal and what is true, then part of what making spiritual discoveries here is about being able to look at our neighbor and look past what looks so convincing as this person's inherent mentality, this person's character, their nature, their personality, and to really discover more about who they are, to discover not just in words, but to the point where we feel it and it feels real and it feels palpable and substantial to us. Feels like this is, wow, I see this person more now. We've all done that. We've misjudged people. We've thought somebody's a bully or terrible, and then we realize later what was really going on, and we get to know them, and it changes. So, we know this can happen, but I'm talking about it happening all the time. I'm talking about it happening with everyone, everybody we look at, everybody we see in the news. It feels radical, but what Jesus preached, what Jesus lived, what Jesus did was pretty radical. What does it mean to really love on a radical level? To love from a godlike perspective, not ignore problems, not ignore bad behavior, not ignore, untruths, but get beneath the surface appearance and really want it, really hunger and thirst, as Jesus said, after righteousness, after a true sense of our neighbor made in God's likeness. What does that do? How does that let in the light? How does it help us see through the excuses, the reasons for division and hate, to reasons for unity, reasons for a way forward? The light that we're talking about, the goodness that we're talking about, is not lightweight stuff. It didn't feel big enough or substantial enough to the people who were looking for a Messiah that was a political leader or a military leader. But Jesus showed that the power of the goodness he was living and proving was far more powerful, far more transformative than that. Stuff where people seemed like their nature would never change, they were changed. Jesus uplifted the lives of so many people, not just in health and wholeness, but in character. What we're talking about here is the sort of Christian point of view is a way to help and heal where there seems to be kind of a hypnotism that has people caught up in it. But like the way that woman broke through that mob mentality that day, and for me, we can do that. We can be part of that. We can bear witness. The power's not in us, but in the light. I think that's kind of the root of what we're saying here today. One last thing before we go to our Q&A. I mentioned Mary Baker Eddy, but I just want to talk about her, especially as an example of what we're saying here today. This woman lived in the 1800s into the 1900s at a time when women couldn't even vote, and she felt stuck, by groupthink, by general impressions about women. She also felt stuck at times by what was a chronic illness that she faced for pretty much the whole first half of her life into her 40s. But as she started to discover more of what we're talking about today and feel uplifted by it, she found freedom, not just from the health stuff. She found health and wholeness in a way that radically shifted her life and freed her. And again, help other people find healing in their lives. And help those people in a very grassroots way go out and help and heal others. In fact, the last 100 pages of this book are all stories of people who wrote in who said the way this book healed them, helped them find and experience God, understand how the Bible applies to our lives today, not just from stuff that was often labeled as incurable, but from patterns of behavior and family situations that just seemed ingrained. And Mary Baker Eddy had this way of reasoning out from a spiritual standpoint that any of us can follow, that really patterns what Jesus modeled for us. To reason spiritually about the stuff we face leads to different kinds of results. When this woman is in a society that says it's literally immoral for a woman to write a book like that, for a woman to go out and give public talks about stuff like that, spiritual matters and so forth. She doesn't say to herself, what does a woman in the 1800s do? She says to herself, what's true? What's needed? And what does that mean for today? What does that mean about what I go do today? What does it mean about how I talk today? And then the results are different. She does write a book. She does found a church. At 87 years old, she establishes an international news source called the Christian Science Monitor. Now, if you're just looking at the surface appearance of things and you think to yourself, woman at this point, early 1900s, still not able to vote, 87, what should I do today? The surface level logic maybe doesn't say go start a newspaper, but when you're reasoning out, when you're really not ignoring but looking deeply at human needs and thinking to yourself, the world needs a news source that isn't just caught up in the real kind of muck raking and stuff that was very prevalent in her time. And certainly we see plenty of it today. You can't be a healer, she reasons, unless you have just the facts from a source that actually cares about healing. So we need to do this. And she captains that project, really leading it forward there in her late 80s. This is like, we aren't defined by our age. We aren't defined by our society. We aren't defined by the stuff we get swept up in. Totally separate from that is a rock of our being, a rock of our identity, of our ability to act freely and in good ways, in ways that do good, in ways that do good that is unstoppable, because that's what good, real good is like. It's not just an opinion thrown in the mix. It's truth. It's reality. This woman, she wrote, she spoke, she helped others on this kind of a basis, and it's a great, fairly modern example of living like that. And of course, there are others that have followed as they've, worked out from this sort of Christian Science standpoint too. All of this is something Mary Baker Eddy felt was what Jesus promised was natural when he said things like, "Whoever follows me will do the works that I do." And the Spirit of truth will come and will lead you into all truth and will explain all things and will help you remember the things that I've said and done. It's just this natural thing to kind of wake back up and remember what Jesus' life is about. Be led by truth to get better results, to be guided and educated, to not just believe blindly, but to understand and step by step, prove what Jesus was living in our lives too. I'm going to pause and let me just go over and we'll check out the question box here, see if anything's come in. And we also won't stick around if there's not a lot of questions. Oh, somebody asked the question, what happened to the daughter-in-law who was disliked by her mother-in-law? Thank you. I haven't done that in a while, but sometimes I talk about what was discovered spiritually, and that feels like the big news, and then I forget to tell you another story. Okay. Well, I'm really glad you asked. You remember she called because the mother-in-law was coming in a few weeks to visit. And so we talked a number of times in that time frame and prayed together. And when the mother-in-law came, it was night and day. There was no, from what she said, no talking it out, no, hey, let's have a heart-to-heart, we should overcome this stuff. It was like somebody flipped a switch. The way she said it, it was like this woman just was loving, and it felt normal. It felt like she didn't even need to question it and ask what had changed. It was sort of like the folks just woke up. It was a really neat transformation, and from what I understand, it really stayed on that level going forward, and the relationship just got a whole lot better. So thank you for asking that question. Really appreciate it. Let's see what else is here. Somebody asked the question, how can we apply the concepts we've been sharing today to the crisis in the Middle of the East? How can we effectively pray to help those in Gaza? How can our prayers comfort those families and so forth? And that's a beautiful question. It's certainly one that's been on my mind. I know it's been on the mind of the folks in Wilmington and all over the world. I don't claim to have all the answers, but I can tell you some of how what we've talked about for me applies. As I've prayed through things, it's been really enlightening for me to get over my preconceived notions about this group is like this and this is how they always act, and this group is like this and this is how they always act, and to feel helpless and to feel halfway across the world. And instead to engage. Sometimes it's not that we feel we even know what to think, but to engage with God, meaning like to open a book like Science and Health or the New Testament in the Bible, and just begin to read with that yearning heart. God, what is it about your nature that will give me another view here of these people, that will show me a different sense of what's natural in my neighbor, to not be trapped by fear, to not be trapped by hate. I was thinking about these images you see sometimes of these little kids, like Palestinian Israeli kids who go to these little private schools like on the border and play with each other. And it's really obvious that these kids love each other because they've learned something different. Somebody who's been educated another way looks at one of those two people from their point of view and hates the clothes they wear, hates the way they do their hair, hates what it all symbolizes, but it's all education. And so at the root is a mentality again. But what that means is that the mentality can be uplifted. We have proof of it, of these innocent kids, and then how they grow up and how they think and how they treat one another. So if there can be a fundamental mental shift, there are radically different outcomes that are possible. So one thing that helps me is to think about, well, what are those mental elements? What is it that seems to be at the root of the perspective of one side or the other? And as I identify those, take it back to that godlike view. Okay, it's kind of like if you're building the rocket and you're like, well, but how do we... I have no idea how to circumnavigate this, but we need to. Okay, well, then you start asking how. This feels like a major roadblock. This feels like a major mentality. Okay, but how? How do I see this from a different point of view, from God's point of view? We have seen in history, as much as things seem entrenched and as much as things seem horrible, and the suffering that comes from these misconceptions is undeniable, whether it's there, whether it's in the example I gave you about women or racism or anything else. But we have examples in history, many, when you actually stop to really think about it, of how whole society can change its standpoint. People who have hated each other for hundreds of years, been bitter enemies, can hate each other. Protestants, Catholics, France, England, Japan, the United States. I mean, when you really look, it's not abnormal. And we look back now and we think of people like, Germany and Japan are like our closest allies. And it seems it wasn't that long ago. It was a very different situation. Mental shifts make massive changes in human views and in human action. Part of what's helpful to me, though, is seeing that that's not just about the big long-term stuff that happens, because if you're like me, the follow-up question is, but people are suffering now. So I get that. I want to be doing that. I want to be diving into those deep views that I genuinely believe, as I discover them, help let the light in and destroy that impersonal error, those lies, that false education that is dividing humanity. But what about right now? What about today? What about the people who don't feel like they have water enough for another week? And I mentioned this just sort of in passing as we went along, but in these same kinds of examples that we talked about, whether it's from the Bible or from history, it's striking to me that the solutions that come are not just the big long-term ones. They're also, I said, intermediate and immediate solutions. That means when we reason out from a truthful standpoint, it's not like we have to forego that for right now, but yeah, we'll think about that in the long run. It's that leads us to how to find water. It leads us to breakthroughs in some policy or mentality that's holding back, resources when they could be there, or too afraid to provide them, or ignorant that they're even there, and an understanding of how to get there. All of that, those immediate, right now solutions that that comfort, that lift off fear, that show ways to be safe right now. I know it doesn't always look like it's there, but that's like the 3 and 6 equals 36 and the suffering that it causes. That is a very lightweight analogy, but it is the same idea that if I care enough, if I yearn enough, then that doesn't lead me to rejecting a spiritual view as something practical and able to lead to immediate, even temporary help right now. It's actually what's desperately needed most. When I'm most confronted and I'm most tempted to be drawn in to that surface level, feeling of desperation, that's the moment where what is needed most is for me to dive in and really look for something that convinces me that the resources that are needed are at hand, that the solutions, the ideas are needed, not just in the people who seem to be suffering, but in the people around them and in other nations, and just because good ideas can come from all kinds of places. I don't mean to go on, but I'll tell you a quick story. I was asked to give a talk one time after two of the Lost Boys of Sudan gave an 1.5 hour long presentation to a leadership group of teenagers, and I was there to support from a spiritual standpoint. Now these were guys whose villages were attacked when they were like 12 years old, and they had to flee the country. They were refugees. They'd at this point lived in the States for about 9 years, and they dealt with some really gruesome stuff, and their families at home were still dealing with it. And so they gave this very compelling, very difficult presentation for an 1.5 hours, and the point was to try and inspire action from these young future leaders. And I think it did its job in terms of like really spurring the heart and making them want to, oh my gosh, what do we do about this stuff in the world? But it was dark, it was hard. And so I was asked by some of the leaders to follow this up with like a 10-minute inspirational talk. What do you say for 10 minutes after this? That feels real. Knowing these guys are sitting in the room too, right? So it's not like, oh, here's some nice theological perspective. It's, that feels dismissive of your suffering. So I talked about something similar to what we've talked about tonight, but I framed it like the difference between sympathy and empathy and compassion. Sympathy and empathy can be a very helpful step, going from I don't care, I'm cold, it doesn't matter, now you're invested. That's a step forward in love. But I think there's a next step, and I don't mean to put too much on these words. That's not really what it's about. It was just a way to frame it that day. But the Bible talks about Jesus having compassion on people, and so I talked about it as the kind of love that doesn't feel sucked into the problem, but the kind of love that helps look beyond the problem to the nature of what is normal and real, rooted in God. And I expanded on that in some ways I have today. And and that was the gist in 10 minutes. But these two guys, they came up to me afterward, and one of them said to me, one of these Sudanese guys, this is what we need. This is what our families need. This is what our villagers at home need. We've given talks like this all around. People always have ideas. There's lots of people trying to make change, but this is it. This is what's going to do it. And for me, that was very confirming, because as we pray about this stuff, the temptation can be strong to feel like, what good does this do? This is just happy thoughts for me in my little apartment back home. But if the people who have been through the worst of it will stand there and tell you, no, these kinds of mental shifts are the things that are like the only thing that's really going to do it. It's a nice symbol that this does matter. The other symbols are the symbols that we live out in our lives. If we're proving 3 and 6 equals 9 in our lives, then we know that 3 million and 6 million equals 9 million. The scale is irrelevant. So we're talking about proving the principle of what is at the root of healing in the Middle East or anywhere else in our own relationships with our own neighbors. And as we're doing it, that also gives us really more than anything the solid conviction, this is real and it matters and it heals. Thank you for that question. See, just looking here again. Oh, a couple of you asked about the end of that story. Thank you. We'll wrap up here after maybe one more question, if there is one. Somebody asked what version of the Bible I read from in 1 Corinthians. That was the New Living Translation. That one about now we see in a mirror dimly. So thank you for that. Another one asked about Israel. Great. I think that's it for our questions. So let me, as we wrap up, let me come back and just, I'm going to read 2 quotes to you and just give a little kind of sign off here. Thank you for taking this time. The first quote here is back in the Bible, and this time it's in 2 Corinthians, and I'm reading now from the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. And it's a simple line. It's Paul writing and saying, "See, now is the acceptable time. See, now is the day of salvation." To me, what that says is this is not lightweight stuff. It's the stuff that challenges us to get all new worldviews, challenges us to rethink what our purpose is, what life is, what real power is, who our neighbor is. And that's not something you just do, like a little here and there, and then I just continue to see things the way I usually do the rest of the time. It's a deep humility that is willing step by step by step, just little by little, to be led. But with each step, Paul's saying, see, now is the time. Right now is the time to make those discoveries. Right now, he says, is the day of salvation. What is salvation in a word or a short phrase? I think we could say it's the discovery that nothing can separate us from the love of God. In the broadest possible sense, as well as in these step-by-step, moment-by-moment kinds of ways. Right now is the time for that. Right now is what Jesus was modeling. Not just a theological view, but a life view. A sense of our being, of reality. And this is back in Science and Health. And Mary Baker Eddy wrote, "It's possible, yea, it's the duty and privilege of every child, man, and woman to follow in some degree the example of the Master by the demonstration of truth and life, of health and holiness." So it's possible for everybody. It's not something we work our way up to. It's not something we earn. It's not something we can mess up. It's not something that we're on our way out or down and it's too late. It's built into who we are. It's not like 3 and 6 equals 9 now, but is drifting towards 9.1 or something. It just is what it is. We are who we are. We are what God has made us to be. Our ability to know what is true, our ability to remember, our ability to care, our ability to discover more is not something we have to earn. It's not something we have to join a club to get or read a book to become. The books and so forth, they're there to help us wake up, engage with the truth in a way that challenges us and helps us go, oh, that's what I already am. That's what is already normal. So it's for everyone. And what does it do? What is this thing that's for everyone? It's the ability to follow, in some degree, the example of the Master, Jesus. By the demonstration, the proving, the living, the experiencing of truth, of divine truth, the truth that is God, and of life, real living, right here and now, the life that is God and of God. And of course, the qualities that come from that, the health, the holiness, the wholeness, the unity, the salvation, the freedom from hate, the freedom from false influences, the freedom to do what is right and to build good governance and good relationships step by step. Thank you. Thank you again for joining. Thank you, though, for being you. Thanks for letting your light shine. Thanks for your willingness to think about discovering more about what God is and for those discoveries as you go forward. It's been really great being here with you tonight. I can just feel the love and feel your dedication of thought. Have a great rest of your night. Thanks so much. Take care.